Imagine you are standing in a pitch-black room. You cannot see your hand in front of your face, but you know you are not alone. Someone else is in the room with you. They have a loaded gun, and they are listening to you breathe. This was the reality for every Allied sailor in the North Atlantic in 1942. We like to think of naval battles as visual spectacles, big guns, smoke, horizon scans. But the Battle of the Atlantic was different. It was a war fought in the dark. It was a war of sound. The German U-boats did not need to see the convoys. They had hydrophones, highly sensitive underwater microphones that acted like ears. In the cold, dense water of the Atlantic, sound travels 4 times faster than in air. To a U-boat commander sitting 80 meters below the surface, an Allied destroyer was not a stealthy hunter. It was the loudest thing on the planet. The vibration of the engine, the cavitation of the propeller blades, the water slamming against the steel hull. Every ship was broadcasting its location for miles in every direction. It was like trying to hide an elephant in a library while it is playing the trumpet. For 3 years, this was a death sentence. The Allies were losing the war of supply lines. Ships were sinking faster than they could be built. The greatest scientists in Britain and America were desperate. They needed a cloak of invisibility. They tried rubber coatings. They tried slowing down. They tried new engine designs. Nothing worked. The physics seemed impossible to beat. But while the experts were looking at blueprints, someone else was looking at a sink full of dirty dishes. And he was about to realize something that would change naval warfare forever. To truly understand the brilliance of the solution, we first have to respect the problem. A steel ship is essentially a giant floating bell. When you start a massive diesel engine, it vibrates. That vibration travels through the steel frame of the ship directly to the hull. And because the hull is pressed against the water, it turns the entire ocean into a speaker system. Water is an incredibly efficient conductor of sound energy. It is dense. It is incompressible. If you tap a spoon against a glass in a swimming pool, you can hear it clearly at the other end. Now imagine that spoon is a 2,000-ton destroyer, and the glass is the Atlantic Ocean. The German Navy knew this. They had developed the Gruppenhorchgerät, a passive sonar array that was terrifyingly effective. They didn't need to ping you with active sonar, revealing their own position. They just had to sit in the silence and listen. They could hear the convoys coming from 50 kilometers away. They could count the propellers. They could identify the class of the ship. They could calculate the speed. All before the Allied lookouts even saw a periscope on the horizon. The British Admiralty was desperate. They threw money at the problem. Top physicists were brought in from Oxford and Cambridge. Their solutions were logical but fatal. They suggested wrapping the ship hulls in thick rubber tiles to dampen the noise. Theoretically, it worked. But in practice, it added tons of weight. It increased drag. It slowed the warships down to a crawl. And here lies the cruel irony. In naval warfare, speed is life. You need speed to dodge torpedoes. You need speed to chase submarines, but the faster the propeller spins, the more noise it makes. The harder the engine works, the louder the ship rings. The Allies were trapped in a paradox. To survive, they needed to go fast, but if they went fast, they announced their position to every U-boat in the sector. Science had hit a wall. The engineers concluded that you cannot cheat the laws of physics. You cannot stop sound from traveling through water without completely redesigning the concept of a ship. They were wrong. You didn't need to redesign the ship. You just needed to change the water around it. While the professors were arguing over rubber density in quiet offices, the answer was hiding in the loudest, hottest, and most unglamorous room on the ship. The galley. The story goes that it wasn't a physicist who cracked the code. It was a man dealing with the mundane reality of kitchen work. He noticed something peculiar while mixing a batter, or perhaps washing the dishes with a high-pressure hose. When the water was clear, the sound was sharp and loud, but when the water was churned up, filled with millions of tiny bubbles of soap and air, the sound changed. It became dull, muffled. It is a phenomenon you can hear in your own kitchen today. Fill a glass with water and tap it with a spoon. Ding! Now, drop an effervescent tablet in it, or shake it until it's full of bubbles and tap it again. Thud. The pitch drops. The resonance dies. The cook realized something that the engineers had overlooked. The problem wasn't the steel. The problem was the connection between the steel and the water. Here is the physics, simplified. Sound waves are lazy. They love traveling through consistent materials. They move easily through water. They move easily through steel. But they hate moving between materials that have vastly different densities. Water is about 800 times denser than air. When a sound wave traveling through water hits a bubble of air, it doesn't just pass through. It slams into a wall of resistance. It scatters. It reflects. It loses almost all of its energy. This is called an impedance mismatch. The idea was staggeringly simple. If you could pump compressed air down to the bottom of the ship's hull and release it through tiny holes, the rising bubbles would form a skin around the vessel. You wouldn't be trying to silence the engine. You would be trapping the noise inside a cage of air. A curtain of bubbles. A masker. To a U-boat's hydrophone, the ship wouldn't sound like a churning destroyer anymore. It would sound like rain or ocean static. Or nothing at all. It was the perfect camouflage. It added no weight, it didn't slow the ship down, and the materials, air and pipes, were available on every single vessel in the fleet. But having a brilliant idea is one thing. Convincing the stiff, tradition-bound admiralty that they should start poking holes in the bottom of their expensive warships, that was a completely different battle. Imagine walking into the office of a high-ranking naval admiral in 1943. The room is filled with cigarette smoke and maps of sunk convoys. These men are watching their fleet get slaughtered. They are tired. They are serious. And you tell them that you want to defeat the German wolf packs using bubbles. The initial reaction was predictable. It was ridiculed. To a naval architect, the integrity of the hull is sacred. You do not drill holes in the bottom of a ship. You do not pump compressed air into the water around your propellers. It sounded like madness. It sounded like a science fair project, not a military strategy. The experts argued that the bubbles would rise too fast. They argued that the air compressors would be too noisy, defeating the whole purpose. They argued that the turbulence would ruin the ship's steering. For months, the idea languished in the purgatory of bureaucracy, but the losses in the Atlantic were becoming unsustainable. Desperation is a powerful motivator. Eventually, almost as a last resort, Command authorized a field test. They took a destroyer, outfitted it with the perforated pipes along the keel, and sent it out to a testing range. A submarine was waiting below, its hydrophone operator listening intently. The destroyer began its run. It was moving at full speed. The engines were roaring. The submarine operator could hear it clear as day. It sounded like a freight train coming down the tracks. Then, the captain on the surface gave the order. Engage the mask. The compressors kicked on. Compressed air surged through the pipes and escaped through thousands of tiny holes in the hull. A thick blanket of white foam enveloped the ship's belly. Down below, the submarine operator froze. 1 second, his ears were filled with the rhythmic pounding of the destroyer's screw. The next second, silence. He checked his dials. He tapped the headset. He thought the equipment had short-circuited. He thought the destroyer had stopped its engines or turned away. But the destroyer hadn't stopped. It was steaming right over the top of them at 20 knots. The wall of bubbles was working exactly as the physics predicted. It was absorbing the sound energy, scattering it, and turning the screaming roar of the engine into a soft, incoherent hiss. The destroyer had become a phantom. When the report hit the desk of the Admiralty, the laughter stopped. They realized they weren't looking at a gimmick. They were looking at the antidote to the U-boat. But a test range is not a battlefield. The Atlantic Ocean is cruel, and the Nazis were adapting. Now they had to prove it could work with torpedoes in the water. The real proof came in the cold waters of the North Atlantic. Picture a U-boat commander. He is a predator. He has been tracking a convoy for hours. He knows the speed, the heading, and the escort pattern. He can hear the heavy thrumming of a British destroyer approaching on his starboard side. He prepares the torpedo tubes. He does the math in his head. Speed times distance equals death. But then the destroyer captain flips a switch. Air pumps scream to life. Millions of bubbles rush out of the keel, wrapping the hull in a chaotic, frothy blanket. Inside the U-boat, the rhythmic thump-thump-thump of the destroyer's propeller vanishes. It is replaced by a soft, white noise. It sounds like heavy rain hitting the surface of the sea. The U-boat commander is blind. His ears are useless. He cannot calculate the speed of the target because he cannot hear the propeller count. He cannot calculate the distance because the intensity of the sound has dropped by 15 decibels. He hesitates. And in naval warfare, hesitation is the difference between killing and dying. While the U-boat crew tries to make sense of the ghost signal, the destroyer is already directly above them. The depth charges drop. The hunter becomes the prey. This simple system, born from the observation of soapy water, saved countless lives. It allowed convoys to slip past the wolf packs. It allowed destroyers to sprint towards submarines without announcing their arrival until it was too late. And the most incredible part? It wasn't just a wartime patch, it was the future of naval engineering. If you look at a modern Arleigh Burke-class destroyer in the U.S. Navy today, or a Type 45 in the Royal Navy, you will find a system called Prairie Masker. It is high-tech. It is computerized. But if you strip away the digital controls, it is the exact same principle. Belt of air. Masker of bubbles. We spent billions of dollars developing stealth technology for airplanes to hide them from radar. But decades earlier, a simple observation about dishwater taught us how to hide 9,000-ton ships from sonar. The ocean is still a dark, terrifying room. But thanks to that moment of clarity in a dirty galley, we learned how to walk through it without making a sound. Sometimes the solution to the most complex problem isn't in a laboratory. It's right in front of you, waiting to be noticed. You just have to be willing to listen to the bubbles.